There's been confirmation of what seems like a disturbing incident in the last 24 hours. It involves an SAA plane which nearly stalled while taking off. It seems the computer system eventually overrode the pilots because otherwise the plane was going to stall, maybe crash. It was the plane that was travelling to Belgium to fetch vaccine doses. There's also a suggestion, strong suggestion in fact, that SAA broke regulations by not telling the South African Civil Aviation Authority in time that there'd been this incident. Guy Leach is the editor at SA Flyer magazine. Guy, good afternoon to you. You and I both weren't on this plane, but what do we know about what actually happened?
Hi, Stephen. Nice to be with you. Well, we know pretty much what happened. You know, these days, aircraft can't do anything sort of under the radar because there's flight radar 24 and any number of anoraks, geeks looking out, checking them out all the time. And obviously, particularly for this flight, because it was such a high-profile public relations exercise, that anything that happened to it was likely to catch the public's attention sooner or later. So we've got a clear admission now that there was what is called this alpha floor event, which is where, as you rightly described, the aircraft had to save itself from the pilots, having made a relatively basic blunder. Now, it's true that there was a glitch, a known bug, if you like, in the flight planning software system. But the point was that this was known about, and correct standard operating procedures for this flight actually took account of this glitch and told the pilots, listen, be careful of this, you've got to double check it. And clearly this double check didn't happen. So the pilots ended up retracting the flaps too early after takeoff, and the aeroplane began to essentially lose height. Or certainly its climb away was compromised. And it reported the pilots essentially to Airbus as the aircraft manufacturers, Rolls-Royce as the engine manufacturers, and to the airline itself, saying, you know, the pilots are breaking the rules here, are breaking the boundaries of safe flight. And this was undoubtedly a severe incident which should have been reported within 24 hours, maybe 36 hours. Certainly there's no reason why it wasn't reported within the 72-hour limit.
I mean, what would have happened if the computer hadn't done what it did?
Well, I don't know whether the pilots would have caught it or not. I mean, we would like to think that they have. But, you know, there are, to me, striking similarities with one of SAA's worst disasters. That was back in 1968 when a Boeing 707 taking off out of Windhoek Airport late at night, as well as was this flight, retracted its flaps too early and just sagged back into the ground with a loss of 123 lives. You know, if that had happened, obviously we would have had a fireball of Airbus A340s through the streets of Kempton Park. Now that we would like to think wouldn't happen because the pilots would be alert enough to catch this. And in fact, a report issued now by the business rescue practitioners that says, well, actually the pilots did know it was happening and did catch it in time. But I'm afraid that's not really plausible because, as I said, the aircraft did report the exceedance. So there's no hiding from that at this stage.
The fact that, so as I understand it, if there's an incident or a serious incident in aviation, you've got 48 or 72 hours to report it to the Civil Aviation Authority. The Civil Aviation Authority, I think if I've understood the statement correctly, says it took 3 weeks for this to be reported.
Well, it certainly reeks of a cover-up. You know, and it's all the more likely because in a sense, there's a sense of, well, what did we expect? There's a sense of schadenfreude here, because the CIA had been already sort of coerced into having granted 13 exemptions to enable this flight to go. All of these exemptions related to pilot training and recurrency. And one of the interesting wrinkles in this whole thing is that SAA couldn't train its own pilots because all its or do the recurrency check on its own pilots because all its own training captains had essentially been laid off or dismissed by the lockout in early December. So they didn't have any captains to do the training for this flight, so they had to find another captain at a separate small privately run training school out of Rand Airport to sign them off. And obviously, I think it's probably fair to assume that this non-SAA training captain didn't know about this glitch in the system with the bug, which required, the pilots to specifically note and check each other. But this is standard procedures. The pilots have to actually check each other on this because it is such essential safety information to get the weights of the aircraft right. And this weight was wrong by 90 tons. That's almost a third of the total weight of the aircraft.
Sure. I mean, that's a big percentage. Is there any relationship, do you think, and I realize you're not an air crash investigator and I'm not either, but you are someone who knows an awful lot about planes. Could this be related to the fact that pilots just haven't been flying regular hours? If I understand it correctly, pilots are supposed to have a number of flown hours. They have to keep their hours up. In fact, they have to basically stay in practice, if I could use that phrase. The fact that they haven't been doing that, could that be part of this?
No, I'm afraid those dots don't join up quite neatly enough in this regard, because this glitch has been known about for some time, even before the actual the lockdown began and the airline stopped flying in March. And so the lack of currency there could not be directly related to this particular incident, except to say that if the pilots had been doing their regular currency tests with SAA, then it's quite probable that they would have been reminded of this particular software glitch and its workaround. But I need to re-emphasize the fact that these miscalculations of takeoff weights have been going on, since aviation started. And the airlines know about this, and they require the pilot who's not flying to ensure, to go through and check off the pilot flying's calculations on these things. So there is very little excuse as we see it at this stage. Obviously, we await the findings of a formal investigation, and that might show up additional information that we don't know about. But in terms of what we know right now, it certainly seems that the pilots made quite a spectacular blunder, and it was on such a showboating public relations stunt of a flight.
SAA, as you know, already has big financial problems. Reputation matters when it comes to airline. If it didn't, we wouldn't see so many adverts for airlines every time you drive through Sandton. It really is incredible how important reputation is for airlines. I mean, this is not going to help SAA when the pandemic is over, is it?
What do people buy airline seats on? It's either price or, the old joke used to be on the width of the smiles of the cabin crew. But obviously, given has to be safety, which has always been said to have been a non-negotiable or the number one priority. The moment there's a query about whether an airline is safe or not, people will choose to go to another airline, which is probably exactly the same price, and fly on that airline as well. So if SAA is not getting these basics right, it really doesn't bode well at all for the restart of the airline when it eventually finds enough market to begin to fly in and gets new aircraft and gets its crew back on board.
Guy Leach, really appreciate the time. Thank you. Editor of SA Flyer magazine. Well, it's an important story. We'll follow the investigation of that with a lot of interest.